I've managed to build a multi-million dollar property portfolio in just a few short years, and I want to inspire and motivate other Australians that if I can do it, so can you. The Tailored Property Wealth podcast has been created to help educate, mentor, coach, and support you through everything relating to property investing to make sure you go out there and make a much better educated decision when investing in property. Please like, share, subscribe, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might see value in it. Welcome back, guys, to episode 2 of the Tailored Property Wealth podcast. My name is Casey Taylor, and I am your host of the podcast. Today, what we're going to be getting into is the 2 moving parts to property investing, which is finance and your borrowing capacity, and then the second thing, your asset selection. And you can't have one without the other. This morning, as we're recording this, it's a beautiful, technically autumn day. What have I done this morning? I went to boxing early this morning, got a boxing session in, feeling nice and awake after getting it in early, getting some endorphins going and trying to get my fitness back to where it should be. So let's get into it today. So finance and then asset selection, right? Unless you're a cash buyer, which let's say 95% of the time I would say you're not going to be a cash buyer, you are going to have to go and talk to the banks, and you're going to have to position yourself so that they're comfortable to lend you money so you can go out, use leverage to your advantage and go and purchase a property. And this is the reality is whether it's an investment property or whether it's an owner-occupied property, that's what you're going to need to do. The second part of that, once you go to the banks, they give you the green light and you can get finance for a property, is that asset selection piece and making sure you get that right. So if you get that asset selection right, it means what's going to happen is you can go back to the bank sooner, get more money to go again, because that property is working for you and you're not having to save your ass off for that first that second purchase like you had to do for your first purchase. Unless potentially you were lucky and you had a guarantor, for example. You can't have one without the other. That is the reality of that situation. So if you want to be a property investor, you have to be good with your finances so you can go to the bank and position yourself in a way that they're comfortable to share that money with you. So get your budget in place and start to consistently save money, put your money away, because when you're going and positioning yourself with the lender, that's going to show that you've got good character, and that's something that they're going to look at as part of that assessment. Getting into this first part, finance, borrowing capacity. Obviously, I am not a mortgage broker. I'm not claiming to be, but I do have a lot of knowledge around the finance piece. If you're wanting further details or anything like that, reach out. Happy to put you in touch with a really good quality mortgage broker. And we're going to kind of touch on a little bit of that in a moment. So when we start to look and break down on the finance piece, there's then 2 parts to the finance piece, right? There is income. How much do you make? How can you service the repayments, the mortgage, the borrowing that you're trying to get? But then there's the second component, which is the security component. Do you have a cash deposit? Do you have a guarantor? Or are you using equity from another property to put down as that deposit? You can't have one without the other, same as the finance versus asset selection, right? So that's just 2 crucial things to remember. Some people get stuck where it's like, I'm asset rich, I've got lots of assets, but then potentially someone doesn't have a job or whatever that is, and you've got to be able to show to the banks that you can make those repayments, and equity alone isn't going to help you service that. So just remember, income and security. When we're looking at then getting finance right, we don't want to get stuck going to one individual lender that you've been with 10 years, they're super loyal, or why you like that lender. That's great. Respect that. But you can still have your banking with that lender, or with that bank, I should say, but go to other lenders. And that's where we use a high quality mortgage broker. And what do I mean by high quality mortgage broker is you want them to not just be a nice guy. Nice guy is great, and that leads into the customer centric focus that you want. But sometimes that mortgage broker doesn't have the technical knowledge or doesn't have the knowledge around lender policy that's going to help you get the result you need based on your individual situation. Okay. So that's just a couple of things that you want to look at when you're finding a quality mortgage broker. Customer centric focus, extensive knowledge around lender policy. And if your plan is to build a significant property portfolio, something crucial that they're going to need to know is trust lending. I'm not going to get into trust lending in a massive amount of depth today, but that is going to catapult you to build a large property portfolio. That's something I'm starting to implement within my portfolio. And if you don't have that mortgage broker that understands trust lending, it's going to hold you back. Okay. A mortgage broker as well is going to open a massive amount of doors of opportunity to different lenders based on your situation, opposed to one door with one in particular lender. A lot of brokers out there have access to 60 different lenders, roughly, I would say. Okay. So it's just super important at the finance part of it that you want to go to a high quality mortgage broker. All right. Now, those are early stages. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to get a pre-approval. Not all lenders are going to do pre-approvals. Um, swings and roundabouts, right, depending upon their SLAs, what everything looks like and what they prioritize. But if you can get that pre-approval, it's great because it's an added level of due diligence that you've done as a purchaser. So you can go out and you can start chatting to real estate agents, and you can position yourself that you're a purchaser, you're pre-approved, and you're ready to purchase. They're going to take you seriously, opposed to the purchaser that's like, oh, I'm not sure what I can borrow, and I don't really have it in place. So I got to speak to the bank or the lender. You want to go in, you want to say, hey, pre-approval, ready to go. You don't want to tell them your budget though, right? You want to keep that information close to your chest because that's part of strong negotiations. That initial conversation with an agent can either set you up for success or set you up for failure down the track when you're trying to secure that property. That's an episode we'll go into down the track is quality negotiations. But getting back on track just to the finance side of things. Okay. So getting that pre-approval, depending upon the lender, you're going to have first tier, second tier, third tier lenders. Some lenders are going to have a larger risk profile than others. And depending upon your situation is to what that deposit's going to look like. For me personally, my first couple of deposits were 5% deposit. Yes, I paid lender's mortgage insurance. Yes, it was quite a large chunk. And yes, the rate is higher in comparison. But if it means you're going to get into the market sooner, you're going to take advantage of capital growth. It's just that return on investment that you need to look at. Lender's mortgage insurance is something that you have to pay as a borrower to protect the bank. That's all that's for. It's not for you, it's for the bank. It's crazy that we have to pay that, but that's just the reality of it. The banks make their money and they protect themselves at the same time, and the consumer ultimately pays for that, who is the borrower. Okay. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. You want to get your pre-approval in place so you can go out there and you can position yourself with those agents that you're ready to go. Now, fast forward, once you've secured a property successfully, you've got that property under contract, then what you need to do, go back to your lender or go back to your mortgage broker and you need to get unconditional approval. When you get that pre-approval, they're going to assess your income, your expenses. They're going to look at that cash deposit or that equity. But there's a couple of different bits and pieces that you'll need to satisfy for unconditional. They'll complete a valuation on the property to make sure if you've paid 400K over, that could be potentially a risk to the lender and they might decline based on that valuation, for example. So it's just little bits and pieces. They'll ask for updated pay slips, make sure you haven't lost your job in that interim period of time from the pre-approval to going unconditional. So that's what it'll look like. They may ask for a rental appraisal if you're looking at and purchasing that property investment, right? So just some things you want to make sure you're ready to go once you've got that property under contract. Once you satisfy finance, you satisfy your pest and building, that property is then unconditional and you move all your way through to settlement. So that's really in a nutshell what that finance piece is. Okay. Just remember, you must manage your money if you want to build a large property portfolio. And that is something as an investor over a 15-year period, there's going to be swings and roundabouts. Rates are going to go up, rates are going to go down. Your cash flow is going to fluctuate over time. Even though rental income does go up over time, your yield on original purchase price increases. We saw that in episode 1 where I broke down the portfolio. But that's just something you need to consistently manage over time, and that's going to help you potentially pay debt down as well. If you can create that cash surplus and continue to delay your gratification for a decade, for a 10-year period, because it's ultimately going to get you years ahead. All right. So just remember that. You want to invest in property, you want to purchase property, you've got to get that finance piece. 95% of the time, unless you're a cash buyer, you've got that large chunk of cash to purchase property, you're going to need to go to the bank, position yourself to get that finance. All right. Cool. Let's get into the property selection side of things. Now, this is kind of, again, just as important as the finance piece. If you make an error now in the property piece, it means that you're not going to be able to go back and get further borrowings from the bank, because this purchase and the first purchase can shoot you in the foot. All right. So what we want to do is we want to understand as an investor, we want to understand what our borrowing capacity is first and what areas that we can afford to purchase in. Because the reality is some areas might be completely ruled out, and that's simply because of what you can purchase. What I did in the early stages of my portfolio, my income was a lot lower to what it is now. And locally here in Newcastle, property prices were a lot higher than what I could afford. So instead of continuing to save, and just constantly be on the back foot to purchase a property here, I started to look nationwide, and I knew that I had to purchase in a state somewhere else so I could get into the property market, so I could start to get that capital growth to then build up to go again. So once you understand what your borrowing capacity is, that's going to give you that clear understanding of what areas that are potentially for you. But another thing that we want to consider is we want to have a really structured process to follow to identify areas that are going to meet our goals so that we can execute on those property goals, build that wealth over time, and continue to purchase properties. So thank you for listening to this episode of the Tailored Property Wealth Podcast. I hope you're learning lots and getting lots of value out of this episode. If you want to discuss the opportunity of working with us here at Tailored Property Wealth, jump across to the website www.tailoredpropertywealth.com.au, complete the contact form, let us know that you're listening to the Tailored Property Wealth Podcast, and let's reach out, let's have a chat and see how we can help you execute on your property goals. So when we're looking at that property, what we are going to be looking for is not chasing high yield properties in a super small regional location that a lot of property investors make. Right now, especially when rates are a lot higher than they were, it costs more to hold a property. We just simply will not go out and purchase in a shitty location so that it costs less for that investor to hold. We want to make sure it's a high quality area that performs long term. So we focus on metro locations, and why we focus on metro locations is because long term houses in metro locations outperform all other asset classes. Property is a long game. We're not investing to get rich overnight. We're investing to make sure we get those small one percenters in place. So over a 15, 20-year period, that we're getting the most return on our investment. So houses over the last 30 years, as I said, 453% growth, outperforming all other asset classes. So that's something super important to remember. But then it comes back to a timing point of view, and you can never time a market. Get in as soon as you can. But what you can do is make very educated decisions around what area is earlier in their growth cycle with a lot more opportunity to grow in the short to medium term. And you might be thinking, shit, how do I go out and look at that and make an educated decision? You can put the research in. There is a lot of research that you're going to have to put in to understand this. And there's going to be a lot of data that you need to analyze as well. All right. So if we're looking at that city, first of all, we can understand what city we can obviously afford to purchase in, and then what is ultimately going to help us achieve those long-term goals. When we're looking at a city, we want to look at things like average income of an area. We want to look at the median value of that city or area and those local government areas as well. Just remember that just because one city you might not be able to afford in one portion of that city, you may be able to purchase in different local government areas. That's a mistake that I made. I think it was 2019. I spoke to a buyer's agent at that time. He focused on one area and one area only. My borrowing capacity didn't allow to get into that area. He said, come back in 6 months. I could have shifted, pivoted, and focused on another area and started to get capital growth. But I waited, still got in, still made money, whatever else. But I could have just made that little bit extra capital growth on the way in that would have just helped me catapult forward. Okay. So understanding that income, that median value in areas, we're understanding the affordability. And affordability is super crucial because it sometimes means that we're earlier in a growth cycle, but we're not at that borrowing capacity ceiling where a lot of people are stretched right to the top of their borrowing capacity. And that means there's just not a lot of room for growth in that area. Whereas if income levels are high and property prices are well under what people's max borrowing capacity is, it allows lots of room for growth. And that's what we really want to look at. It all comes back to income levels, right? There's lots of other reasons that we'll take a look at now. But if people can't afford to borrow more money and push prices higher, they won't continue to grow. So affordability is super crucial. And over time, you can understand what markets at any one time are unaffordable. Great example right now is Melbourne, Sydney, even Canberra are very unaffordable. Brisbane has taken over Melbourne as it's continuing to grow in terms of medium value, but they typically perform better in the first half of the cycle. You Sydney and Melbourne, second half that we're in now, that's where those more affordable areas start to grow because they're earlier in their growth cycle. And that affordability piece is taking into account your Brisbane, your Adelaide, your Perth. Now, in addition to that, some of the things that we want to look at is infrastructure spending, because with that comes lots of different things. It brings more population growth. Another thing we want to look at, population growth and migration. But it brings more people to an area, typically in the construction space, that sort of thing, high income earners injecting money into that economy, which continues to just prop up the city as a whole, and that flows into everything in that local economy, right? So there's some things that we want to understand. The infrastructure spending, migration, population, but we also want to understand supply and demand, right? And this is why we like metro locations as well. Established properties in metro locations, there is not massive amounts and abundance of land that can be created. So there's always going to be that tight-knit supply and demand ratio that we're after. Ultimately, we want low supply with high demand, And if we're looking at those past things that I've discussed, it's going to continue to put that demand on an area. But as there can't be more land created unless it's well and truly well outside the city, there is limited supply being added, and that creates scarcity and continues that performance long term. We want to understand building approvals as well, right? Because sometimes in an area there might be an abundance of building approvals if they're knocking up um, your builds where there's a massive abundance of apartments, 200 in a building, whatever. And that's why we just simply don't touch that super high risk. But we want to understand the building approvals and the supply being added to an area. So that is a lot of what you want to look at in a city location, right? All right. So understand what your borrowing capacity is because that may rule out some areas. You don't want to waste your time on areas that just simply you can't afford to be in, right? We want to focus on those areas within the budget and find a solution within that budget that's going to help you catapult forward. Once we identify a city, then we want to look at those different local government areas. And as I said, you might not be able to afford to be in one local government area, but you can afford to be in another local government area. Or you might be able to afford to be in both, but then there's different metrics within that that might cater differently to what your goals are and what your brief is. A big one sometimes can just simply be rental yield. Again, we don't chase rental yield alone. We balance the two together. We want capital growth, but we also want a strong yield where it's not costing us $30,000 on one property per year, right? Right now, it's just normal for a property to cost you about 10,000 to hold. All depends on the cash injection into the deal. The more cash you inject, um, the more cost effective it's going to be in terms of your holding costs. So that is something to consider. But we just simply will not chase yields alone. But you might target an area that's got a 5% yield versus an area that's got a 4% yield. So that's one thing that we want to look at. We want to then break down on that individual local government area, sometimes suburb level, the average incomes of that area. If everyone in a certain local government area has extremely low income, it comes back to that borrowing capacity piece, right? However, gentrification does occur, and that's where we can get into markets a little bit earlier. And as that gentrification piece happens, more people from other areas will start to move to those areas, push up the income, push up the prices as well. So it is something to consider because people start to get priced out and it's this ripple effect. Easiest way to think about this is as you're closer to the water, for example, in Newcastle, those areas are multi-million-dollar suburbs. People get priced out of that and they progressively start to move back out from the ocean to more affordable areas. And that happens in cities as well, right? So it's just that ripple effect that you can take advantage of. You can look at some suburbs, just a couple of suburbs back that might have a lower median price, lower income, and as people move into that, it pushes prices higher. We want to look at past growth, 12 months, 5 years, 10 years. You just want to look at what that consistent growth is long term. And that's where we can see that some areas might have underperformed over the last decade. And there's a lot of data to suggest if it's underperformed in the last decade, it's going to overperform on the next decade. Especially if you look at that 10-year period, it's under what potentially that 20 or 30-year average capital growth rate is. Gives you a good understanding of that growth. Comes back to supply and demand again, right? Touched on building approvals, still super, super important. We want to make sure there's not much supply being added to an area, but the demand is still there. What are some of the reasons or some of the metrics we use to understand that the demand is still there? Median days on market is a really good one. Comparing 12 months ago, what the average price was, average days on market, I should say, is versus what it is today. If that's significantly improved over 12 months and lowered, that shows that there's a lot of demand in that area versus 12 months ago. Properties are selling quicker. On the flip side, if median days on market 12 months ago was 10, now it's 40, you can see that the demand's dropped off in that area. Properties are sitting longer. A lot of areas we target right now, days on market is under 10. Crazy, selling in the first open home and well above that list price. So it is something really good to understand. Median vendor discount is another good one. What are vendors discounting off that original list price? Okay. If they are discounting massively, you can couple that with that median days on market, and you might see that they're discounting because there's less people in the marketplace and there's less competition. This one, for me, sometimes it is hard because vendors can get a little bit greedy. So they might list well and truly above where the market sees value, and then they naturally have to drop back in line to where market value is. So it can skew it. That's my personal opinion. So just something to always couple with your median days on market. Another one to look at, vacancy rates. Vacancy rates is a precursor for growth, and sales numbers as well in an area. It's another good one to look at. So that's kind of the asset selection in a nutshell. You want to make sure you get your finance in place. You're setting yourself up. You're getting as much borrowing capacity as you can for your individual situation. Doesn't mean you always need to use your max borrowing capacity if you can find solutions well under that. But then once you've got your finance, you want to go out and get that asset selection right, because once you purchase that property and you get that capital growth, you no longer need to save deposits anymore. You're making money while you sleep. You can then use that capital growth and that equity to go out and purchase another property. And this is where it starts to get super, super powerful in building your property portfolio. I've made purchases in the last 18 months to 2 years that have done 150 to 200K growth. I've now been able to go out, go back to the banks, get valuations, extract that equity back out of those properties as deposits on future purchases. I have not had to put any cash into those purchases whatsoever. All right. So for me, my situation, I can just continue to invest my surplus back into my business, which is super beneficial. But on the flip side, I'm also out there and I'm still building on my property portfolio so that it comes a time in the future that I'm just creating a passive income from that portfolio. So asset selection is key, but you can't purchase the asset without the finance first. So they complement each other, and you really want to smash both of them out of the park. That's the episode, guys. I've been waffling. I love this shit. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you've got any feedback as well, if there's something I can be doing better or there's things that you like, please let me know, because I'm all for improving, being able to make it more enjoyable for you guys, the listeners, so you can take more away from it. I really just want to be able to give back as much as I can so you can go out there, make more educated property decisions, smash it out of the park, and complete your goals. So thank you for listening. Appreciate it. Episode 2 is done and dusted. Speak soon. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you don't already, make sure you follow us across all of our social platforms. That can be Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook. I wish you all the best out there on your property investing journey, and I hope each decision you make in purchasing more property gets you closer to your goal of financial freedom.